The blue waters of Wyvern shimmered in the morning light. Courtney stood with her fellow mages across the shoreline. It was the same area where Anwen had fallen into the water after they'd been attacked by the Fallen. The peninsula jutted just as majestically out over the water as it had back then. Only now she could enjoy the beauty of it. But that wasn't where she focused her attention. Several dragons had joined them this morning. They were of the smaller variety, and she doubted they had the ability to transform into any other shape. If they had, they might have already done so. It would have made introductions easier. Of course, it was also possible that some knew but chose not to use that ability. She wasn't sure how it all worked. True to his word, Kern had asked for volunteers to work with the mages, and several had stepped up to the challenge. Courtney had to give them kudos for that, she supposed. There weren't many who seemed inclined to give the mages a second chance. At least not those who came from the mage circle. The jury was still out about the others. Callum stood next to her side, thankfully in the guise of a man. At least he wasn't leering over her, making snide comments about how this was a pointless exercise. He was there to make sure no one got hurt too badly. At least, that's what he told her.
Listen up,
Courtney called out, amplifying her voice to carry to all those assembled.
This is a test to see how well this will work out. If it does, we'll keep going. We're all going to break into groups of between 2 and 4 mages, with 1 dragon per group. Now, for this to work, we need to learn how each fights. From there, we can figure out how to complement each other with our different styles. Callum will help me pair you all up.
The mages listened with rapt attention, even those older than Courtney. She'd come far in the few days since being given this assignment, and she wasn't about to disappoint them. She owed it to Anwen to uphold the position of Kaida, not cheapen it with antics. She would work just as hard as any of them, harder if she had to prove her worth. Going down the line, she and Callum split up the mages with their dragon counterparts. Courtney had learned some of the strengths and weaknesses of her fellow mages over the past few days. Now she wanted to use that to the fullest advantage. Callum knew his kind better than she ever would, and she appreciated his insights. With everyone paired up, Courtney gave them the opportunity to get acquainted. One couldn't fight as a team if he or she didn't know who they were fighting with. She wasn't a military commander, nor did she have the insight of a soldier like Walter did. She'd have to do the best she could. Soldiers worked as cohesive units. She had to help these smaller groups work in a similar manner. They had to trust each other implicitly. Their lives and the lives of everyone else depended on it.
Okay,
She called out, amplifying her voice once more.
we're going to begin with a few simple drills. When in battle, especially fighting with a dragon, it's a good idea to take advantage of everything you can. So let's see how well you all do with a little flying. It's better to find out now if you can handle it than in the heat of battle. We will each take a turn flying, one at a time, so we don't overwhelm our dragon friends.
Callum transformed back into his draconic form.
You heard the friend of the Kaida.
He growled.
Mages, mount your dragons. Fellow dragons, do not do anything foolish. If you are unable to resist childish antics, you will be disqualified from this training. This goes for everyone, including you mages. No exceptions.
Despite not liking the idea, Callum knelt so Courtney could climb onto his back. He was a bit surprised by the care she took not to dislodge any of his scales as she moved to a position just above his shoulders. In fact, he could barely feel her once she'd settled behind his neck ridges. He looked around to see if the others were ready as well. Those who were not riding this time around had moved back to give them room. They'd seen enough of dragons to know there would be a great upsweep of air when they took off. It could knock them to the ground if they weren't careful. Those on Dragonback looked a bit nervous. Some reached for harnesses that weren't there, as if they expected to ride them like horses.
When you ride a dragon,
Courtney called out over the slight breeze that had picked up.
do not try to control them. Either you work together, or you work without one. Think of yourself as an extension of them, and them of you. We will each take a turn around the lake, and then come back so the others can have a turn.
Hands rose to shade eyes as the dragons kicked up from the ground, their wings working to create an updraft. Without the use of the drop-off formed by the peninsula, they had to resort to a bit more difficult takeoff. But they seemed little affected by the extra weight they carried as they launched into the air. Several voices called out in awe at the sight. The different colored dragons indeed looked impressive as they rose in the air. They then dove towards the waters beneath them. A few dragons even performed a couple acrobatic motions, setting their riders' teeth on edge. But no one got dunked into the water and no one got sick. When they returned to the ground, those who'd stayed behind rushed forward for their returns. Courtney glanced around in satisfaction. So far, so good. The next test would be to see how well they could work together in a combat situation. They would take things one step at a time, but she had high hopes things would work out for the best. They had to. Tydler pressed ahead, pushing through the tall grasses. They'd had to leave the car behind an hour ago. There were no established trails out here in the wild parts of the plains. Anwen had declined having Tydler transform out here where no one would see them, even though he felt more comfortable with the idea. She had her reasons, he supposed, though he wasn't entirely sure they had to do with her fear of heights. Scrub and trees interspersed among the typical vegetation. They gave the area a variety they all could appreciate, even if the stones underfoot occasionally caused ankles to turn or strides to be lost. Regardless of such obstacles, they were making good time, and Anwen seemed to be doing much better than she had the day before. He thanked the stars for that. For her part, Anwen didn't so much as worry about whether she was able to keep pace or not. She did without conscious thought. She'd been given a lot to think about already that morning, and her mind set to the task of soaring through it all. Meanwhile, her feet carried her wherever they needed to go. All she had to do was follow Tydler, and she knew she wouldn't end up going astray. He knew where he was going, even if she didn't. Walter kept pace. He'd grown used to such treks over the course of his career in the reserves, and he hadn't backed down from the physical challenge after his honorable discharge. He had a lot to think about as well. It had been a long time since he'd actually last thought of his departed family. He found he could look back with a happy sort of melancholy, instead of the gripping pain that used to be there. The pace Tydler set wasn't too bad, all things considered. He could have moved faster, but chose not to overexert not only his companions, but himself. They still had a ways to go, he was sure. The mages wouldn't have left just one or two clues. There were likely more. And it was anyone's guess where those might lead them. Ahead, they all could see something protruding from the ground. The closer they got, the more pronounced the natural obelisks became. As they angled to one side, it became obvious that they were 3 pillars instead of 1. They thrust up towards the sky like silent sentinels. No 2 were the same in height, though the one in the middle towered over the other 2, which offset their formation to create a sort of rough triangle. Out of breath, the 3 companions slowed to a stop within 100 or so yards of the megaliths. Anwen bent over to catch her breath. Now that they weren't running, her lungs reminded her of how she uses them in ways they weren't used to being used. A little more accustomed to the long haul, Walter paced to cool down. While he did that, Tydler gazed up towards the tallest of the structures.
Okay. Remind me where we're supposed to look?
Tydler requested as he leaned backward a bit to stretch his back. He'd slept on it funny. The lumpy mattress was likely to blame for that, but he wouldn't let it keep him from pressing on. Anwen thought back to the clue she'd been given.
Across the plains, you must venture. If your heart be true, find the next turning in the middle. The beacons wait for you.
She recited.
Find the turning in the middle.
She glanced up at the middle pillar. It somehow seemed different from the others, though she couldn't immediately say why. Not bothering to look at the ground beneath her feet, she continued towards the megaliths. Part of her realized the shortest one was at least a dragon's length in height. The middle one towered over her like a silent needle of stone. It had weathered over the years, but was nowhere near ready to topple over.
Find the next turning.
She muttered to herself as the others followed behind her. A circle of stone enclosed the pillars in a 50-foot radius from the center. Unlike the one encompassing the sacred grove, this one seemed constructed of red and brown sandstone. It looked just as rough. The first pillar seemed bleached from its original darker beige. The further ones sat dark and forbidding. The middle pillar stood like a proud king, made from some kind of dark red stone she didn't recognize. Walter was about to step over the bounding circle to follow Anwen inside when Tydler held him back with one hand.
Wait,
He instructed.
let's see what happens first.
The moment Anwen set foot over the sandstone boundary, she felt a change. As though the world had gone as silent as it had in the forest temple. Not even the sound of a bird filled the air, despite her seeing one flying nearby. Despite the harder, packed earth outside the boundary, the dirt inside was loose like fine powder. No plants grew inside it. It almost seemed as though time had stopped the moment she crossed the threshold. Except there was something else there. It took her a moment to realize what it was, though. There was the faint hint of buzzing. She tilted her head to one side as if to better hear the sound. Then she closed her eyes. The sound changed the moment she closed them. Instead of buzzing, it sounded faintly of drums. And they were pounding out a beat her feet didn't want to ignore. From outside the circle, Walter and Tydler watched as Anwen seemed to skip into a sort of dance. Her arms raised into the air as her feet moved almost of their own volition. Whatever music she danced to, it wasn't audible to either of them. But from deep in the ground they could feel the thrum of something that wasn't drums. It seemed to coincide with her movements as she danced. Eyes still closed, Anwen moved by pure instinct, following the sounds she heard around her. She twisted and turned in a manner not unlike the dragon dancers back in the village of Lindworm. Had she stopped to think about it, she would have realized she was following the exact steps of the grand dance. It was the same dance those carrying the large dragon puppet around the stage had performed. Tyler recognized the steps from the Dragon Moon Festival after her first repetition. He hadn't caught on to the pattern at first, even though he knew the dance better than anyone. It almost seemed as though her image blurred the closer she got to the central pillar. And then she went behind it and didn't come back around. Walter cried out in alarm when she disappeared and moved to enter the circle once more. But the Dragon Lord took a hold of his arm, pulling him back.
Wait,
Tyler admonished. He closed his eyes, still sensing her heart beating with his own. If he concentrated, he could almost see her in the alternate plane she now inhabited. Anwen kept going. She seemed unaware of anything else outside the circle. Had she looked, she'd have realized pretty much everything had disappeared from view. But she didn't, and so didn't know. Instead, she continued to dance to the beat coming up through her feet. Each turning brought her closer and closer to the central stone. And then she was right up against it, except it wasn't there anymore. Instead, the shadow of a woman faced her as she opened her eyes. The Kaida blinked in surprise, though part of her had somehow expected this to happen. And all through this, her steps never faltered.
Cross the Duros River and find the crags tall. Near the dry lake, your next clue will fall.
The woman intoned in a contralto voice. She neither looked to the left nor the right. It almost seemed as though she could see right through the mage, as Anwen paused for what was only a moment. The next moment, she'd swept back into the dance. With eyes closed once more, Anwen finished out the steps of the dance. She came around to the far side of the third stone, almost as if she'd only skipped from one to the other in the blink of an eye. She turned around the final pillar, coming back to her starting place with an exaggerated bow. It resembled the same bow the dancer she'd imitated had used back at the festival. Her fingers almost touched the ground from the depth of it. Anwen opened her eyes and saw Walter staring at her like he'd seen a ghost. Tyler's expression was unreadable. Feeling a bit self-conscious, she walked back to the bounding circle and stepped across it. A sense of static electricity filled her as she stepped back onto the hard-packed dirt. It left the hair crackling as she rubbed her hands against her pants.
Well, that was fun.
She commented as the two continued to stare at her.
Looks like we might get to go swimming.
Tydler let out his held breath at her hint of humor. Remembering she didn't know how to swim,
What's the clue?
he asked. He nodded when she told him.
I'm pretty sure I know what it means. Though this one is far from specific. Could be anywhere within a mile radius of the center of that lake.
Well, this should be fun.
Walter commented as he looked up towards the sky. The sun hadn't reached its zenith yet, giving them plenty of time to head back to the car and around to the Duros River. Once there, they might have to switch to something a bit more rugged, vehicle-wise. He supposed they'd cross that bridge when they came to it.
What are we waiting for? Let's go.
Tydler gave Anwen's hand a bit of a squeeze before letting go. He then moved into an easy jog, heading back the way they'd come. The others were not far behind. Courtney fell back against the grass, out of breath. She'd gone up every time one of the other mages had, flying on Callum's wide neck. The sensation was exhilarating. Part of her had the temerity to wonder how Anwen could fear it. There was so much freedom in the sensation of flying. She hadn't wanted to come back down, but knew it was necessary. The other mages had broken out lunch baskets while they waited for the last bunch to return. They planned on staying out all day. Those not willing to try their luck with the dragons remained at the city. Instead, they tried to reorganize it to some semblance of decency. The dragons napped. In their normal form, they only ate every few days, which was just as well. None of the mages who had volunteered to train with the dragons had failed the flight test. It was something Courtney took as a personal victory. She wondered how Anwen would have fared trying for the same results. They wouldn't have gone well, she was sure. Callum sat on a nearby stone, once more in mortal form.
It might be wise to work on transformative skills next.
He commented. He watched the wind blow across from the open expanse.
Our best course would be to have one mage mounted, while the others offer ground support.
Courtney found she had to agree. There were currently more dragons than mages, but she knew not all of those dragons were willing to play party to her little experiment, unlike the ones who had joined them that morning. Chances were good they hoped to do the most damage without their mortal counterparts. She couldn't really blame them. The mage circle had been around a long time. Resentment likely continued, even though they were technically gone.
We should have some mock battles.
She stated.
Start small and go from there. Even though I've been working with the others for a few days now, they're nowhere near ready to take on a revenant, let alone much of anything else. Margot would say their skills lacked on an epic level.
The dragon chuckled.
I think I would have liked to know this Margot you keep mentioning. She seems as though she may have been a worthy acquaintance.
The mage nodded, her eyes misting a bit.
Yeah, she was pretty much as feisty as you are.
She knew it was a bit of a barb, but she didn't take it back, even though Callum seemed less than pleased with the comment. She smiled to soften it.
But she also understood what needed to be done, and wasn't afraid to do it. I didn't know her long, but I miss her.
Callum pursed his lips at this revelation. He had never known the woman, but she'd made some kind of impact on this mage, leading her to a more upfront approach. Or that might have just been her personality. It was both annoying and admirable. She didn't take any guff from anyone. He only hoped she'd be able to take orders later on when it really mattered. Seeing the others were about finished eating, Courtney moved to rejoin them. It was time to see how well they would do working in teams, and not just with flying. She had seen enough to know who would do well on Dragon Back. Part of her suspected the dragons had a preference as well.
All right, everyone!
The mage called out. She cupped her hands near her mouth to make her voice carry further.
We're going to stay in our current teams, and we're going to have some mock battles. One of the mages in each group is going to ride Dragonback, while the others offer ground support. If we're going to learn how to work together, we're going to have to practice communicating in each group. Once you've figured out who's going to do what, line up at the lake shore and we'll go from there.
The various dragons and mages regrouped into their respective teams. After some dithering back and forth, they decided who would do the riding. None of them knew what Courtney and Callum had in store for them. As such, they weren't sure what to have those chosen for ground crew do. They slowly made their way to the lake's shore, turning to face Courtney and Callum. The two had moved to stand near the middle of the giant wedge of allies. Callum transformed back into his dragon form. He let out a call that sounded something like a trumpet, more organic, mixed in with the call of a bird of prey. Water shot up from the lake as a dozen water dragons leaped into the air. Their serpentine bodies glistened with water on mostly blue and green scales. The mages looked behind them to see the water serpents as they spouted liquid. A few of them flinched as droplets of water scattered around them, getting several of them wet, laughing in relief when nothing happened. The Dragon Lord called for their attention once more.
You will be going up against the might of the Imugi dragons,
He announced.
It is your goal to incapacitate them, without causing them undue harm or killing them. This is not a real battle, but you must treat it as though the stakes are the same. You will spread out along the shoreline and attempt to subdue them from there. When either the friend of the Kaida or I call for you to break away, you are to do so immediately. Are there any questions?
As there were no raised hands, Callum moved towards the lake shore, Courtney by his side.
The first half will prepare for mock battle. The other half will watch and observe. We will then switch.
Courtney went over to make sure everyone knew which group they belonged to. Once those were assigned, the observers moved back to give the combatants room. At a signal from the Dragon Lord, the groups on the ground attacked.